Yeah, good morning again. Welcome to the Green in the Banks event, Introduction to Finance Emissions Accounting and Emissions Reduction Target Setting for Banks. I am Huệ Nguyễn, Clean Energy Project Associate of Allotrope Partners and Green in the Banks Vietnam. I am honored to host today's timely webinar with special attention to providing insights into the methodologies and practices adopted as well as fostering collaboration and knowledge sharing. Next slide, please. Again, a little bit about the housekeeping. If you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A box in Zoom. If you have technical support questions, please use the chat box. We also have the translation services, so you can use the interpretation box with the globe icon here if you want to use English or Vietnamese, and the webinar will be recorded. Next slide, please. Yes, so about the agenda for our event today. Firstly, we will begin today's program with a sharing from Mr. Tung Ho, the country director of Allotrope Partners, about Greening the Bank's initiatives progress by 2023. And after that, Mr. Thiraphon Pramsit, from the principal technical consultant from Environmental Resources Management, ERM, will share insights about the overview of finance emission accounting. We will then hear from Mr. Howard Shi, the technical manager of financial institutions from Science-Based Targets Initiative on emission reduction target setting for banks. And finally, we will have a Q&A session where our speakers will answer audience questions. So please feel free to send your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the program. This event will be recorded, summarized with keynotes, and posted on Allotrope Partners website for future reference. Next slide, please. So firstly, I would like to invite Mr. Tung Ho to share about Allotrope Partners as well as Greening the Bank's activities and progress to date. Please give a round of virtual applause. And Tung, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Hui. Thank you all for being here. I think it is great that today we are kind of closing the Green the Bank 2023 with a more close, I think a more intimate session just for the bank themselves. We're glad to record the registration for more than 10 banks for this event. So that's great. And we have a representative here on this, a bit newer on the topic side. But I think we'll need to discuss and eventually address this kind of exercise for Vietnam to go forward. And then to start off for today, I think just an overview of Allotrope Partners in the countries. We are a clean energy and decarbonization advisory firm based in California. And we entered in Vietnam since 2018 together with the World Resources Institute and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory under the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator Program. But recently we do have a shift in our work. As you might be aware, this is one of the green finance work that we do with the bank for Green the Bank. Aside from that, we have also worked with local partners on decarbonizing industrial parks and industrial zones in Vietnam, as you can see on the photos, as we present the concept to the Prime Minister and the different ministers during an event in Hanoi. And we also dabble a little bit in project development as we install and operate one of the first behind-the-meter solar plus storage project in Ho Chi Minh in 2022. And then in 2023, we take that further with the city of Ho Chi Minh by working with the World Bank on leveraging the low voluntary carbon market to finance different solutions for the low carbon city of Ho Chi Minh across four pillars of work, including energy efficiency, rooftop solar, uh, public lighting, and last but not least, the electrification of transport. So those are the kind of, I think, progress that we have made in 2023 with Allotrope in general. But for today, I'd like to focus more on greening the bank. So just as a context, greening the bank start off, in Philippines with the banking sector. And then we did eventually see an uptake of interest in Vietnam as well. That's why we brought the program to the region. And ever since we have established not just in, I think, in the Philippines, there are certainly more banks on the more for I think on the more regional and I think kind of local levels as well. A network of hundreds of banks in the Philippines. And also, we also make a breakthrough with the Philippine Central Bank through regulations and policies as well. In Vietnam in 2021 and 2022, that's the first year that we start working on this topic. And that's when we engage different partners that can include HSBC, BGTI, or ICMA to talk about a variety of topics when it comes to Green Finance 101. In 2022, the results that we had is very positive. We work and partner with the Vietnam Bank Association, which brought together, a maximum more than 160 participants at one of the events to cover a lot of topics when it comes to, for example, green loan and green finance framework and how that will lead to products, and also the different ESG management system that the banks can adopt in Vietnam. Most of these topics are quite new in the country itself, as the topic of ESG is only taken up recently in the past 2 years. Also, by financial institutions, firstly by funds and asset managers, and then eventually by the banks. So we were glad, to tackle the first block of capacity building in 2022. I think that's the first step towards the market by having a series of dialogue and series of training on this different topic. And that, I believe, serves as the basis as we move into 2023 with more, I think, streamlined and more focused and more targeted kind of interventions with a smaller group of banks, and also with a smaller group of decarbonization developers, and to connect the banks with the actual projects on the ground. I'll go into that right after. So from the start of 2023 until now, I think there have been a few major tasks that we have kind of accomplished. So we did screen the different banks in Vietnam. We have nearly 20 banks, both I think state-owned and also commercial banks to a certain degree. And with that, we did that study, also engaged them directly to create a short list of 3 to 5 banks to really map the progress and plan the action for them to encourage their lending activity and investment into projects that can result in meaningful emission reduction. So that was, I think, the first quarter of the year we did that exercise. And then we also execute, on a similar webinar like this one, but on a larger scale. To kickstart the year, I think we invited Mizuho and Sustainalytics and others to talk about green finance framework, as I think we have seen progress in that space in Vietnam with 1 to 2 banks like VT Bank and BADV, both of which have issued their own sustainable loan framework or social finance framework using international practice. And also for both of these banks, I think they are trying to work out green products and green loans to accompany this framework so far. And with that, I think it's a great basis for us to work out towards the middle of the year, where we try to find a way to connect the banks themselves as they have this framework. How can they make the right lending and then make the right investment into corporates that perhaps have the KPIs in terms of sustainability and also emission reduction, or perhaps in projects like clean energy projects that can result in meaningful reductions. So we try to work that out. And finally, we felt that for banks, uh, a very private and I think a bit more direct environment is more conducive to them in all of these conversations. And hence, I think in the past 3 months, we have conducted closed door matchmaking events, like connecting banks to actual corporates and projects on the ground. Uh, these projects and corporates can vary not just in the clean energy space, but we also have people in the energy efficiency space, in the I think green agriculture space as well as various others. So in this particular closed door matchmaking session, we had invited two major local banks which have the framework ready, which are BIDV and VPBank themselves. We also have the presence of international banks in Vietnam. These are the Korean bank, Shinhan Bank of Shinhan, and then Mizuho from Japan. And the reason why we select these four is because we have worked with them directly, and through our screening exercise, we have also found that they do have a real interest in lending to this project. But we know that it does take a while to for banks to move from the initial meeting phase towards due diligence and then eventually I think the transaction itself. But I think having this kind of closed door session, with Allotrope, as the not say as the middleman, but also as the independent, advisory partner. We help to broker many of these conversations fully on a non-profit basis, just simply to walk the bank through some of the projects and also to explain to the project themselves what is required, by these banks. Because we do see that many corporates and projects, sometimes complain that is it the bank's own talk about greening their portfolios and activities, and then when they themselves come to the bank, it's not that easy to get a loan, or is there any preferential rate that is available to this kind of green activities? So we help to walk the corporate and the project through this step. They need to understand that it's not easy for the bank to make a transaction in a space that they are, I think, mostly not familiar with. I think in Vietnam, many of these lending activities are in the real estate sector, and then the kind of collateral they need to have is quite practical, which some of these projects may not have. So hopefully, through this initial conversation, we can break the ice and help at least understand what is the gap in the market between banks and their framework and their product uh, versus the project, and with their cash flow and emission reductions, and how these two sides can eventually meet subsequently. So I think that is our aim. That was our aim for this year, and we were very happy to hopefully successfully conduct some of these sessions for the banks and developers and corporates to get together and brainstorm. So I think very briefly, I do not want to take too much time from our esteemed speaker for today, because I feel like those content are much more interesting. But it's worth taking a look. We did take a look back at 2023, and we want to look ahead as well. I think we hope to continue, green the banks in 2024. I think as I mentioned, in 2022, the Refinance 101 approach perhaps worked for the more mass kind of capacity building, objective, where we seek to have a series of videos and training that are available on our website, that banks or whoever, is interested can, check out as resources at will. Um, and then that is the first step. And then in 2023, we try to narrow that down, and I think to really to categorize the different banks by the progress in the market, and to really find the kind of solutions and find the kind of right support for each of these, category, whether those are champion banks who have made significant strides in the space, or those are emerging and I think potential banks who have an interest but lack the capacity or lack the kind of right support, the right foreign support to execute, many of the things they want to do, or the very, banks who are beginners in the space who are just in the process of finding out. So that's why we categorize and, you know, through our different exercise this year, whether that is closed door matchmaking or just a webinar like this one or the one in the past, 6 months, we want to target, specifically the banks that require our our support. I think for this particular session is aimed at, banks who are a little bit more advanced market, who are already thinking about key questions of, uh, how do how do we become a net zero bank? And that's kind of the question that we receive. I think that is a very simple question, but how to tackle that requires a lot of steps, which our presenter today would be very much more well positioned to answer that more than I do. And looking ahead in 2024, we hope to, I think, bring a more focus to our support. We hope to engage and collaborate with one champion bank to work on this, this emission, their finance emission, and also the scope 1, scope 2 emission, calculations, and for them to, take the first step to understand where they are, and then eventually work on, whether they are in the right place to establish reduction, emission reduction targets for the bank and for their portfolio. And for this champion bank to serve as a case study, for the market, so that, the rest of the business can look to that and see that, okay, that's actually possible, to a certain capacity, and they can look to that, and just have resources to have emulate and develop their own kind of pathways in this space. So that is the kind of one-on-one, engagement that we hope to have in 2024, and then also continue to connect banks, champion banks and emerging banks who have an actual interest in lending to corporates and projects that that have emission reduction potential, and to have more of those social matchmaking sessions where perhaps we aim to close the transaction itself. Uh, I won't promise anything, but that is certainly our goal, is to have real transactions on the ground. That's the ultimate objective for banks to be to have meaningful, lending in this space and have the additionality for the country in general. As we, as Vietnam looks to perhaps, meet the target of net zero in 2026, 2050. So that is what we plan for in 2024. But I think going back to today, I think all of those things need to start, with a brief overview of what is actually, the definition of financial emissions, and how you go about calculating that. And once you have done that, can you begin to think about your emission reduction targets, whether that's near term or long term. So those are the kind of key questions. Sorry, I missed this slide, but I think that has been covered in my previous uh, ramble already. But going back to this to the question that we received about net zero banking, I think a few major banks in Vietnam, knowing that Vietnam needs to meet the net zero target, and that begins with things like low carbon industrial parks, low carbon city, and would that translate to a low carbon bank as well? And what's defined by a zero bank or a low carbon bank anyway? And I may not have the answer to that, but our speaker actually do. But when we begin to brainstorm that question and see how we in the bank play support in that capacity, we look at I think a few alliances. Like I think in the region there's globally there's the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which I think no one no banks from Vietnam have actually successfully participated in. But because the kind of commitment that's required is quite significant for many banks at the moment. Perhaps not so for banks in Malaysia or Singapore or Thailand, where the kind of capacity is a little bit ahead of us. But for banks in Vietnam, it's difficult for us to join this alliance and then to make the commitment without knowing what it actually implicates in terms of their top management commitment, also in terms of different teams. So that's why we always go back to the bank and say that before you make any kind of join any kind of alliances or make any kind of commitments, you need to know where you are first, and that is thing that's sorely missing in the market. As as far as I'm aware, none of the banks in Vietnam or even more broadly financial institutions have attempted this type of exercise. So that's why we're here today. We invited two esteemed speakers today to speak on the topic. Firstly, on the constellation, and secondly, on the target setting. So I'll pause here and I'll leave the floor back to Wei to introduce the other speakers.
Thank you, Tùng, for your informative overview of the activities in Vietnam until now, and also some basic information regarding the finance emission accounting and emission reduction target setting. So up next, I would like to invite Mr. Thiraphon Ramchit, the Principal Technical Consultant from ERM, who will be sharing insights about the overview of finance emission accounting. Mr. Thiraphon, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'll firstly introduce myself and quickly introduce ERM as well, especially for those on the call who may not know our organization. So I myself, I'm Thiraphon Ramchit. I'm a Principal Technical Consultant at ERM, and I've been working with ERM and ERM for the past 12 years with a focus on greenhouse gas inventory, not only in the finance sector, but also for the industrial sector. So, I am from the Thailand office, but of course, ERM, we have been working for a long time in Vietnam as well. ERM is a global sustainability consultancy, and our focus is to help corporates, including financial institutions and banks, in their sustainability journey, both in terms of understanding the impacts, quantifying impacts, reporting, and then also on the ground work. So we focus both on what should be considered at the management level, but we can also support on the ground where needed. So maybe if we go to the next slide, it's just a quick agenda in terms of the points that I will talk about today. Of course, the section that I will be talking about is about financed emissions, and is a very important segue to the next section, which will be talking about in terms of target setting, because of course it's very important first to calculate the emissions and understand how much emissions are related to your business. And then the next step after calculating those emissions is to set a target on how to reduce the emissions. And today I'll explain in the first section on the background on greenhouse gases, why that is, why greenhouse gases are important. And then there will also be, then I'll go into a little background on what the financed emissions are. And then I will go into the details on how to quantify the financed emissions based on the PCAF methodology. And I will also provide some case studies so you can see, especially in this region, what other financial institutions are doing in terms of reporting. So just as a quick recap, what are greenhouse gases? So there are a total of 7 gases that are listed on the slide. So there are 6 gases here, and then there's one additional gas called nitrogen trifluoride. But out of these 6 gases, the most important is carbon dioxide in terms of volume. And just a reminder for everyone about what the greenhouse gas effect is. So these gases are called greenhouse gases because they produce what is called the greenhouse gas effect. Under a normal condition, and the reason that the Earth, the world that we live in, is we are able to live in it because there is a certain amount of heat that is retained, giving us a comfortable temperature to live in under the natural greenhouse gas effect on the left, at a natural level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But what has happened is, according to the activities on the left, on the right, there are more and more greenhouse gases being produced by humans. So we're not talking about the natural emissions. We will only talk about the man-made emissions that are generated by man-made activities. And you can see the different kinds of activities on the right, and you can see that the majority of emissions are coming from energy consumption, the combustion of fossil fuels that produce greenhouse gas emissions. The second highest is in terms of agriculture, forestry, and land use, waste and industry. And you can see that there's also a breakdown in terms of where the energy is being consumed. So, and you may have heard about it. So the important numbers or metrics that you need to remember are what's called net zero by 2050, and to limit the global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. So what this means is, according to what I presented in the previous slide, if we continue to increase the greenhouse gas emissions like you can see historically, then this will cause the world to warm on average around 3 degrees Celsius if you look at the case that is shown at the top. But according to climate scientists, the level of warming should be reduced to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Any increase in emissions higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius could be irreversible and would produce too much physical impact that includes flooding and drought. So what you can see on this slide, and there are many different lines. So the top lines are if each of the governments in this world produce or reduce the emissions at the level that they have committed to according to law and according to policies, then even with the global targets, and you may have heard about Paris Agreement, the amount of emissions increasing will still be in the range of around 2.6 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. So organizations such as Climate Action Tracker and Science-Based Targets, like what Howard will describe later, the importance is not, the important thing to note from this slide is that the action from governments alone is not sufficient. If we just rely on the action from the governments, it's not enough. because what we need to achieve is the bottom line, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius compatible, which is achieving net zero carbon emissions by around 2050. So you notice this line is not completely zero, because but if you go net zero carbon, there would be still some remaining greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so the idea is that companies, corporates, private institutions will need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where the banks play an important role, because you finance these institutions, these companies, and you have a role in influencing what kind of lending that you go towards. For example, under the Green the Banks initiative. So we want to try to focus banks in lending in areas that will help to support the global decarbonization, rather than lending to companies that will produce more emissions in the future. So the key takeaways from this slide, as I mentioned, so the global target is net zero by 2050, and everyone will need to contribute to it. And the temperature rise can be no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And governmental action is not enough. The private sector will also need to act to contribute to the gap that we can see here, and it is a large gap. Okay, so then we talk about more about specifically about the banks. So there are three main sources of emissions. There will be the direct emissions. So for a bank, that could be your corporate vehicles, and that typically in this region in Asia, that would be most of the emissions from scope 1. There may be small amounts of emissions from refrigerants, and overseas, in countries that are quite cold, there could be natural gas that's being combusted in the office buildings to keep the office buildings warm. And this scope, what we call scope 1, is the only emissions that the companies or your bank is directly responsible for. The other two scopes, which are called scope 2 and scope 3, are indirect. That means that a third party is responsible for those emissions. For scope 2 is your electricity provider. It could be the national grid, or purchasing electricity directly from your supplier. So they are the ones who combust the fuels to produce electricity for you. Therefore, it's indirect. And final important one for finance institutions is what we call scope 3. So, and it's important because of the last category that you can see highlighted in the slide is category 15, or investments. And there are two parts of scope 3. And the easy way to remember is that the upstream activities will typically involve the spending of the bank. So what the bank is spending on the equipment in the bank, computers, etc., everything that's needed to run the bank, paper, transportation services, etc. So whatever you're spending on to facilitate your business, then that would be included under the scope 3, under the upstream activities. For the downstream activities, this would be where you're getting revenue from. And typically for finance institution, so you see the number of activities here. Most of these will not be relevant to the bank. The one that is usually only relevant to the bank is the investments. So it's related to the bank, again, because you gain revenue from your investments or your lending activities. So when you lend your money, you gain the revenue through interest. And under Greenhouse Gas Protocol, because you're gaining revenue, because it's related to the financials of your business, then it is counted as what we call the scope 3 of your emissions. But because it is scope 3, what it means is that it's the emissions of your investees or your counterparties who you're lending to. It's not your emissions. So that's why there's a big challenge for scope 3, because it's outside of your control, and sometimes you may not be able to access data. But under the concept of the, as I shown in the previous slide, in order to decarbonize, there needs to be a change in the emissions of companies, and a large portion of those emissions may come from, it may be financed by banks. So this diagram that I've shown here is a classic diagram from Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the standard for companies to account for greenhouse gas emissions. And separate from Greenhouse Gas Protocol is what's called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, or PCAF. So PCAF has been endorsed by Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So what Greenhouse Gas Protocol does is provides general guidelines for all kinds of companies, but for different sectors, different sectoral groups have come up with their own separate guidelines for the sector. And because for finance industry, there's a lot of complications with the way that you would need to calculate the emissions. So a large number of financial institutions have partnered up for the Partnership for the Carbon Accounting Financials to set up a standard way for all finance institutions to calculate their emissions, so that it's all standardized, and that the emissions from one finance institution can be comparable with that of another institution. Okay, and under the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, so there are a total of these 7 main what we call asset classes. And in addition to this, PCAF over time is adding more and more guidances. So in addition to this, PCAF also has guidance on insurance. And the important part of PCAF is that it's an evolving standard. So at the moment, there are a limited number of asset classes that are included for greenhouse gas calculation. So what that means is that if the asset class, you may notice that it is possible that there are certain asset classes that are relevant to your business that are not included here. That means that for now, they will need to be excluded from the financed emissions exercise until the PCAF has published a new methodology. But for banks, typically, almost all of these activities could be relevant to the bank, depending on your financed activities. The definitions of these are I think from a finance institution point of view, should be relatively straightforward. But when conducting the inventory exercise, you will need to closely look at the definition that is provided for PCAF for each of these different asset classes. And because I assume that those on the call today, I think you probably understand these asset classes. So I won't go into detail in terms of the definition of each of these asset classes now. Okay, so we talked about the different asset classes, and the main challenge for finance institutions is the accuracy of the data. So as I mentioned, the emissions that you're calculating are the emissions of a third party. By that sense, sometimes legally, there are confidentiality issues. So that third party may not want to share their detailed information with you for you to calculate the emissions. And there may be also confidentiality in terms of the bank, in terms of providing the emissions and disclosing it publicly. In any case, the idea for financed emissions is that you do not, and actually for scope 3 as a whole, so for scope 1 and 2, companies are expected to have an accurate calculation, because for scope 1, you, for example, will know the amount of fuels that you purchased, and you can trace the fuel purchase based on invoices and billing. Same goes for scope 2, which regards to electricity. But for scope 3, you do not control the sources of emissions. You cannot directly control the amount of emissions, and you cannot directly measure it. So therefore, you rely on the third party to provide you with information. If you're lucky, then for PCAF, there's a scoring methodology from score 1 to score 5. And score 1 means it's more accurate. And if your counterparty or the party that you're lending to can provide you with the emissions numbers, and they have conducted the calculations for the emissions, and for score 1, it means that they have also verified their emissions. Then and you obtain that data from the counterparty, then it will count as score 1, meaning that it's accurate. You're certain about the emissions because it has been verified by a third party, and it is the data source is coming directly from your counterparty. But that in the real world situation, most banks will need to use a combination of the different scores. So for maybe company A, it might be score 1, company B, it might be score 3, and PCAF accepts that within your inventory for different companies, for different transactions, you can use a different score for calculating the emissions. And the further down you go, the more is based on estimation. So I'll give you one more example. Further down, closer to the bottom, is for score 4. So for score 4, the minimum amount of data that you would need is the amount of revenue of that counterparty. And from that revenue, using what we call emission factors or conversion factors to convert the revenue into emissions, then you can calculate the emissions based on estimate. And PCAF completely accepts that even if the finance institution has only score 5, for example, that level of detail of data is still sufficient for the finance institution to set targets. But PCAF expects finance institutions to improve the data quality over time, as shown on the graph on the right. So if you're starting at score 5, then you should try to improve to score 4 and 3, etc. And further in the future, after setting the initial target, the finance institution can set up new targets to reflect the improved quality of the inventory and the updated greenhouse gas emissions in the inventory. So I think I want to reiterate, because I do understand from working with other companies that are financed institutions. So the exercise for greenhouse gas inventory is completely different from financial accounting. So financial accounting will need to be very accurate, but especially for scope 3 and especially for financed emissions, it does not need to be completely accurate from a verifier's point of view. So if the finance institution calculates the emissions and wants to do a third-party verification, what the verifier is looking for is not 100% accuracy. The verifier is looking for the source and the method of the calculation of the emissions that is in line with PCAF, and that the assumptions are all traceable for the calculation of the emissions. And this will be one of the main challenges for the finance institution in terms of obtaining accurate data. And in some cases, you may not be able to collect any data at all. So you will need to calculate or keep track of the emissions that are excluded from the inventory. Okay, I'm just aware of time, so maybe we can move on. Yep. So in terms of why the financed emissions important globally, so you can see that the global debt, both private and public, is around $307 trillion. And if you convert that into carbon, for example, if we assume that the public debt, and you can see on the graph on the right, is the rates of emissions per million US dollars GDP. And you can see that the USA in the set of example that I provided is around in the middle in terms of emissions. So if you're just looking in terms of public debt, then the rough amount of emissions could be around 24 billion tons of emissions. and that's roughly almost already half of the global emissions. So there's a lot of emissions that are related to debt globally, and the idea is that different countries, if it's sovereign debt, then there's different amounts of emissions depending on the country. And then for private debt, I've given 5 examples here, but you can see that the amount of emissions is quite drastically different from different industries. So the idea is that the financial institutions should try to look for lower carbon emissions in terms of the types of companies that is being lent to. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, another important reason why finance emissions is important. So this is data from an organization called CDP, which is closely related to science-based targets. And for CDP, they collect the data from different companies. And for the finance sector, around almost 100% of the emissions are coming from the what we call the investments or the financed emissions. So that's why it's very important for the finance sector. Okay, and we've already talked a little bit about this concept, but I wanted to add one more layer. So I've already mentioned that the finance institution in the middle is lending the money to the counterparty on the left. And so this transaction in terms of money, this then, if you can follow the money, then that means that the finance institution will need to calculate the emissions under scope 3. But one more layer above is in terms of the asset managers. The asset managers manage the investments on behalf of the client. So from their point of view, the emissions are called portfolio emissions or assets under management. And the standard, as mentioned previously, for companies, the emissions, which are called scopes 1 and 2, will be calculated under greenhouse gas protocol. For the finance institution, for scope 1 and 2 will also be based on greenhouse gas protocol, but the scope 3 financed emissions will be based on PCAF. Okay, and in terms of the calculation, so on paper, actually, the calculation is and the concept is rather straightforward. So as you can see in the graph at the bottom, so this is a typical showing what the amount of debt is over time. So the amount of debt will go down as the counterparty makes the repayments on the loan that was made. And according to PCAF, the percentage of the emissions that the finance institution will need to take under what's called an attribution factor is the percentage according to the value of the loans outstanding divided by the total value of the counterparty company. So if it's this example is for a listed company, then for a listed company, we need to look at the metric called EVIC. From this, then you would, as you can see in the graph at the bottom, so you would know the percentage of the debt as a total of the total value of the that company, and that will be the percentage that the finance institution takes the part of the emissions of the counterparty. And there are 2 main methods here. So if the counterparty knows the emissions, then they can they should provide those emissions to the bank, and then you can calculate the emissions. But in the case that the counterparty does not have the emissions, as mentioned previously, you can use revenue and what's called emission factors to calculate the emissions by multiplying the revenue by a certain factor. And this exercise will then need to be conducted for all companies within your portfolio or all lending activities, all transactions, as much as possible. And as mentioned previously, if there's need to exclude the calculation, then the finance institution should have, the bank should have a reasonable explanation on why that point of data is excluded. And of course, you would need to calculate the emissions every year. The main thing that will change, both of these factors, both the attribution factor and the counterparty emissions would be changed every year. And according to PCAF, we would select either the first day of the year or the last day of the year to represent the emissions for that year. Yeah, we can move on. So I won't go into this in detail, but there are other metrics as well. So in the previous slide, we're talking about absolute emissions, but in terms of benchmarking, we would need to use what we call intensity metrics, comparing, for example, if it's economic emissions intensity, so that's per US dollars of the loan outstanding, and for a weighted average. So this is with regard to the revenue of your counterparty. These metrics can help you to compare with other banks or internally. The other metric that I mentioned before is the data quality score. So once you calculate all of your emissions, and as part of the calculation, you should calculate the PCAF data quality score for each transaction, for each company that is in your portfolio, and they will be consolidated one number for the whole company. And the final one is about temperature score, which I'll go into more detail in the next slide. A temperature score is another method that's, I'm sure Howard will go into in a little bit of detail, that's accepted for finance institutions in terms of setting targets. So what the temperature score looks at is the targets that are being set by the counterparty, and the finance institution can track these as an alternative way to set targets. And the lower the temperature, of course, the better. And the target, as mentioned before in the previous slide, is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in these three examples, PTT has no target, so the emission, the temperature score is around 3. GPSC has a target, but it's not net zero by 2050, so the score is around 2. And the final example is Delta, which has net zero target by 2050, so is compliant with 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, so now we can go through some illustrative examples, and these are some of the clients that ERM has supported in Thailand. So I've shown just now in terms of the temperature score. So what we did for the clients is we looked at all of their investments that are shown in the left graph in terms of in green and gray, and we benchmarked it against the temperature score of the stock exchange. So the average temperature score of the stock exchange of Thailand. And we can see also breakdown and for this client, then if they want to pursue further in terms of targets, means that for the companies highlighted in red, which have the temperature score over 3, that means that they, this asset manager will need to engage with those investees. Next slide, please. Yes, and in terms of calculations, there are 2 main methods. So various providers such as Bloomberg, MSCI, etc., they have the solutions to calculate emissions. But if the company does not want to invest in those solutions, a simple Excel-based tool would be needed with the inputs on the left in terms of the financial data, the greenhouse gas data, and then the calculation as shown in the previous slide, multiplying the attribution factor by the emissions, and then also calculating the score, the quality score for PCAF. Next slide, please. Okay, and just quickly introducing, so of course, ERM, we have some solutions specifically designed for finance institutions to support in the calculations of the emissions in your portfolio, and in terms of target setting as well, aligned with science-based targets as well. Next slide, please. Okay, some more examples of how to disclose. So when the bank, in this case is a bank, so the previous example was asset manager. So this bank, which is one of ERM's clients, has disclosed, and this is actually the recommended format from PCAF. But what they were not willing to disclose in detail is as you can see, is the percentage breakdown of the portfolio by monetary value as a percentage. But what they have provided is for each sector that they have lending to, they have split the emissions by scopes 1 and 2, which are the mandatory scopes, and then scope 3, which is the optional scope for calculating the financed emissions. And you can see they provided a data quality score, which is not yet very good, so it's almost 5, so almost at the bottom. But as I mentioned previously, it's often very challenging, especially for private companies or SMEs, to collect data. And this is just one more example of the visualization, and then also showing that for this client of ours, asset management, there are 2 parts, so that there are parts that are not calculated yet. So 22% of the portfolio is not a PCAF asset class, so we did not calculate it. There's a very small 0.001% where we could not calculate due to missing data. And then we provided the metrics for the remaining 78% that we did do the calculations for total emissions, the total intensity, and then the data quality score. Okay, this is a similar example as previous, so we can move on. And then I think the final main concept that I haven't talked about is around avoided emissions. So I talked a lot about emissions, but you can also track the positive effects. So in this example, it's for solar. That means that if you are lending to solar activities, then you can also calculate the positive impacts, and you can also disclose them. PCAF doesn't have exact methodology for this, but I can show you in the next slide what that looks like in terms of public disclosure. So this is another one of ERM's clients based in Switzerland. So they focus on managing investments with regard to low carbon energy, which is on the left, and they quantify the positive impact of these investments in terms of emissions. So this may not be directly related to targets, but this can help in terms of the PR and in terms of public disclosure to your stakeholders. And then I think this is the final slide in terms of sharing in terms of best practices. So what ERM does, and I'm sure a lot of other institutions does as well, is we've talked a lot about the different metrics, and there are a lot of different numbers, but in terms of the management and the strategy of the bank, we suggest some metrics like shown here. So is comparing the top left graph is comparing the intensity of emissions with the amount of investment. So as shown by the arrow, you want to have as low amount of emissions per US dollar of the loans outstanding that you have as much as possible, and to increase the amount of the AUM in there. And by using such a diagram, you can prioritize which companies you may want to engage with in terms of emissions, and what kind of companies that you may want to invest more that produce lower emissions. Other ways are prioritizing by emissions again in the bottom left, tracking the emissions over time, and also looking at your overall portfolio emissions by sector as shown on the bottom right. So I want to quickly conclude in terms of the next steps in the journey, typically for financial institutions. So definitely from what I presented, is mostly around the baseline in terms of the financed emissions. If you follow the steps as shown previously and follow the guidance of PCAF, then you have the baseline emissions. Then from that, you can analyze and you can see which counterparties will need to be engaged with. So, I mean, the two main strategies is engaging with the counterparties or simply managing your investment or your lending policies. Engaging with the counterparties for greenhouse gas data. So I showed the example from the Thai bank, which has a score of 5, which means that they have not yet received actual data from the counterparties. So that could be a next step. Once you've recalculated the emissions, then you can re-baseline the emissions. And once you are happy with the accuracy of the data, you can think about setting either science-based targets, or if you're not yet ready yet, non-science-based targets. Thinking about the low carbon loans policy, and then thinking about engaging with the other counterparties as well. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I will now hand over to Howard. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Thiraphong, for introducing finance emission calculation, which we believe are highly valuable for banks and other financial institutions. We will definitely want to learn more about this in the Q&A session. And next, we now move on to our next speaker, who will discuss the emission reduction target setting for banks. So please join me to welcome Mr. Howard Shield, Technical Manager of Financial Institutions Science-Based Targets Initiative. So Howard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. As we mentioned, my name is Howard Shi, and I am a technical manager for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTi for short. Today, I'll be giving a brief overview of our framework for financial institutions to set near-term emission reduction targets for their operations, as well as their investment and lending portfolios. In case anyone is not familiar with the SBTi, it's a collaboration among CDP, the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF, so 4 well-known NGOs. And as Thiraphong mentioned earlier, that government action isn't enough at this point. So kind of SBTi's aim is to drive the private sector to take ambitious climate action. And we do this by 3 things. So 1, we define and promote best practice in emission reduction targets that are in line with climate science. 2, we provide resources and guidance to reduce barriers to adoption. And 3, we independently assess and validate targets. So in terms of target frameworks, the SBTi was launched in 2015 with a framework for companies in the real economy to set near-term targets. That was followed by a framework for financial institutions in 2020, which I will talk about today. Since then, SBTi has launched a net zero framework for long-term targets for corporates in 2021, while that will be developed for financial institutions over the next year or so. On the next slide, you can see a broader context. The SBTi is just one of the resources in a larger ecosystem that is working to scale up company climate action. So as Thiraphong gave an overview of, the first step really for companies and FIs is to begin estimating and measuring their emissions inventories. And as mentioned, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and PCAF are 2 leading examples of resources to do this. And then next, while some jurisdictions have introduced reporting requirements, the broader mandatory disclosures in more recent proposals around the world are an essential next step. Now, where the SBTi comes in, and a key differentiating factor is our independent assessment and validation of targets. And this is based on public, quantitative, and robust criteria that have been developed via an inclusive and transparent multi-stakeholder process. So whereas GFANZ and the various net zero alliances, such as the NZBA that Tong mentioned, while they have mobilized member institutions, the SBTi uses mandatory criteria to assess targets independently. But nevertheless, the mobilization and strategy support provided by GFANs are an essential complement. On the next slide, before we get into how to set science-based targets, why should companies and FIs set SBTs? Fundamentally, the business case is that it will help lower risk as well as add value. So first, businesses that fail to decarbonize will become increasingly exposed to climate risks. These companies and the FIs financing them could then face financial impacts due to, for example, rising energy costs, carbon taxes, reputational risks around not acting, and of course, stranded assets. At the same time, science-based targets push FIs to gain insights into the transformations that companies and industries will face. So this then helps identify opportunities that benefit from the transformation to a zero carbon economy, which includes the development of innovative products and services that support climate mitigation and adaptation. They also better position your organization to adapt to shifts in public policy as governments ramp up climate action. On the next slide, to date, the SBTi has over 6,000 companies who have committed to set SBTs, and over half of those have already had their SBTs validated, of which around 80 are from financial institutions. So this includes banks, asset managers, and asset owners across various geographies. So in particular, on the next slide, we have 17 FIs based in Asia Pacific with validated targets, namely in South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Australia, and New Zealand. And then in terms of emerging markets, we also have FIs in South Africa and Mexico. And we also have another about 32 based in Asia and 6 in Oceania that have committed to setting targets. So how can financial institutions set a science-based target? So this table outlines what a FI is required to do, as well as some additional recommendation. Just to note, the SBTi is aiming to update its near-term guidance for FIs in the coming months. So this table really reflects our current version, but this may need to be updated for any criteria changes in the future that likely will include an increase in ambition. But in terms of our existing criteria, essentially, an FI will need to address its own scope 1 and 2 operational emissions, and they are strongly encouraged to deal with its scope 3 category 1 to 14 emissions, such as from purchased and sold goods and services. But the most material activity that an FI is required to tackle, as Turpan mentioned, is its scope 3 category 15 emissions from loans and investments. And also separately, FIs will also need to disclose certain information, including its emissions footprint, target progress, and actions taken. So on the next slide, we have a graphic that shows a step-by-step process for a financial institution to set a science-based target, which we will go over the next several slides. So the first step is for the FI to define its organizational boundary and compile its emissions inventory, at least for its operations. And then the second step is for the FI to determine the ambition of its scope 1 and 2 targets. And what this usually means is a minimum 4.2% linear annual reduction in absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions over a near-term target period. So for example, a 42% reduction by 2030 if using a 2020 base year. For FIs that have not yet switched their electricity to renewable energy, there's an opportunity here to meet these reductions that are required for such a target. The third step is then for the FI to decide whether it would like to set optional targets on its scope 3 categories 1 to 14 emissions. So another example is their business travel. And what this usually means is at least a 2.5% linear annual reduction in absolute emissions in the scope 3 category. So these targets are currently optional, as we would like to ensure that FIs, again, focus their efforts on their most material emissions from their scope 3 category 15, which leads us to the next slide. So in this key step, an FI will figure out its target boundaries, which the SBTi aims to strike a balance between robustness and practicality, taking into account, for example, data availability, level of influence, and the sector's contribution to climate change. So here on the slide, we have essentially a summary of our table 5.2 in our guidance document, which summarizes which financial sector activities are currently required, optional, or out of scope in terms of being covered by targets. It also indicates the minimum coverage needed for required activities, as well as the methods that can be applied to each activity, which we'll go over in the next few slides. But just to note again, the SBTi is aiming to update its near-term criteria for FIs in the coming months. So this table will likely be updated to reflect some proposed revisions to provide some more granular specifications and clarifications. But maybe just a few examples first. So for example, consumer loans related to residential mortgages are currently optional. So as such, there is no minimum coverage requirement for this activity, and FIs may cover as much of this activity as they wish. However, if they are covered with a target, the sectoral decarbonization approach, the SDA method, must be used, which we'll go over soon. Meanwhile, corporate loans are required to be covered by targets, but with varying minimum coverage percentages that are depending on the borrower, but with all three methods available to be used. In contrast, sovereign bond investments are currently out of scope, as there are no applicable target setting methods or emissions accounting methods really that can be used currently. So in the next slide, step 5, the FI proceeds to use any mix of the 3 target setting methods that are currently available for FIs under the SBTi framework to develop targets on the asset classes that we just saw on the previous slide. Of course, we encourage FIs to go above and beyond the minimum requirements and develop targets on optional asset classes to exceed the minimum target ambition required, as well as follow our other recommendations. On the next slide, we can go over the first method that we have. So that is the sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA for short. And this is a physical intensity-based method. And it essentially looks at tracking reductions in emissions per unit of production. So for example, an FI can set a target to reduce emissions from the steel sector within its corporate loan portfolio by X% per ton of steel produced over a 5 to 10 year period. So this method is supported by target setting tools that are available on the SBTi website. And these will be needed to calculate the minimum ambition needed for SDA targets. And that is really based on a FI's particular portfolio. And then just a note, generally we've seen most, if not all banks use the SDA, and it's likely due to banks having kind of sector specific strategies. On the next slide, our second method is the portfolio coverage method. And this can be described as a target of targets So it simply requires FIs to engage their portfolio companies and have them set their own SBTs, such that the FI will have 100% coverage of its portfolio by 2040 at the latest. So for example, an FI can commit to half of its equity investments, setting their own science-based targets over a 5-year period. Generally, we've seen most, if not all, private equity firms, as well as some asset managers and asset owners use the portfolio coverage method. And banks also often use this or the next method to supplement its SDA targets. So on the next slide, the third method is the temperature rating method. And this expands on the portfolio coverage method, really, in that FIs will, again, need to engage its portfolio companies to set ambitious targets. But here, the targets just need to be public and don't necessarily have to be validated by the SBTi. And Tirpon mentioned this briefly, but yeah, essentially under this method, each of the FI's portfolio companies will be assigned a temperature alignment score based on any public emission reduction targets. And then these temperature scores are then aggregated up to a portfolio temperature score for the FI. So the FI would then commit to reducing this portfolio temperature score to, for example, 1.5 degrees Celsius over a 5-year period. So after setting this target, the FIs would then engage its portfolio companies to set toward better temperature trajectories, which would in turn improve the FI's portfolio temperature score. So this method is supported by additional resources on the SBTi website, including a methodology document, tool user guide, and recorded webinars. And in fact, we recently released a video on how to use our SBTi temperature scoring tool. Generally, we've seen many asset managers and asset owners, as well as some banks, use the temperature rating method. So on the next slide, with these 3 methods, an FI would then develop clear and quantitative public target language in step number 6, as well as a summary of strategies and actions that they plan to use to achieve its targets. So once FIs have developed their targets, they can fill out a target submission form that is available on the SBTi website. And once they upload this submission form, they can then reserve a slot for the SBTi target validation service via our booking system. In terms of process for target validation, after the booking date arrives, a reviewer will start the evaluation and send over any questions that may arise. Once the first reviewer finishes, the target submission will then be passed on to a second reviewer, which may require further queries. So kind of a 4 eyes process there. It will then be discussed and formally approved by our target validation team. In terms of time, I'd say the target validation process roughly takes about 1 to 2 months from the book time slot, though it will really depend on the number of question rounds as well as the response times. So we've had cases where FIs, sail through in a matter of weeks, but we've also had cases where the FIs weren't able to respond months at a time. So obviously that took several months there. On the next slide, just to summarize the step-by-step process. So after an FIs are approved by the SBTi, it is then required to publish its targets on the SBTi website in step number 7, as well as to transparently track and report on its target progress on an annual basis going forward. And just a note that you can find all of the published science-based targets on our website. So on the next slide, so that was an overview of the SBTi near-term target framework for financial institutions. Just like to note that we are currently developing a net zero standard for FIs that will cover both near-term and long-term targets. In terms of where we are in this process, the SBTi has published a foundations paper formed an expert advisory group and published a conceptual framework draft with consultation. There will be feedback as there will be more public consultation after another draft is completed. So on the next slide, I know this was quite a lot of information, so I recommend taking a look at the SBTi website for more information. And please feel free to reach out to the SBTi financial sector team through our online community forum, where you could read all the previously asked questions and responses, as well as raise any new questions from your end. So with that, I'll stop there and pass it back. But thanks again for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Howard, for your insightful information about emission reduction target setting for banks. Yeah, so I really want to know more about this in our Q&A session. And now that we have finished all the presentations from our speakers, yeah, I would like to invite everyone to join the Q&A session. However, as our time is limited, I think we are gonna have maybe just one or two questions for our speakers today. Yeah.
That's great. I think with the 5 minutes left, I think one question for Mr. Terpon and Howard would suffice for now, and then we hope to engage the other banks afterwards.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Tung. Yeah. So I think for the banks, maybe this question is for you, Terpon. How can we choose the most suitable accounting partners for measuring our finance emission, considering the portfolio composition, the reporting requirements, and stakeholder expectations? Thank you.
So what was the question? The accounting partner? Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah, for the banks. Yeah. So how can the banks choose the most suitable accounting partners for measuring their finance emissions, considering their portfolio composition, the reporting requirements, and stakeholder expectation?
If you're talking about partners, meaning maybe a consulting partner or something like that, I think it's from my experience, it's really a blend of both, because of the greenhouse gas side is quite complicated, and the finance side is also quite complicated. So, you know, and maybe the practitioner, for example, myself, I'm not really a finance person. So, but what we do with the at ARM anyways, we have you know, one team that at least has strong fundamentals in greenhouse gas accounting, and but also we have finance experts as well to supplement. I think that's really important when looking for a partner to support. Yeah, and yeah, I think that's it for me. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Terpon. Yes, and I think time is now for us
I think that you can have one question for Howard, and then we can wrap it up.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Bong. Yeah. So so Howard, what are the practical first steps for the local banks in emerging markets to set a science-based target for their finance emissions?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that we may have briefly touched upon this. Really, the first step is to measure your emissions footprint. It's because really, you can't manage it until you measure it. So definitely measuring it is a first step. So you kind of know, where are your financial emissions coming from? So maybe it's coming from only a handful of companies, your portfolio companies. So it would make sense to kind of try to focus your engagement efforts on those handful of companies that are generating a large portion of your overall portfolio emissions.
Yeah, and maybe some more information for the emerging markets. So have you observed any differences, like difficulties for the local banks in the emerging markets compared to the ones in developed markets? And yeah, what should they prepare for their journey with target setting? Thank you.
Sure, I can be quick. So yeah, essentially probably related, just in terms of emissions data, sometimes is not as readily available in certain markets compared to, for example, countries where there are regulatory requirements for companies to report. So maybe just example is, I think Korea and Taiwan, I think there are regulatory requirements to report emissions. So we've seen many banks in those two particular markets setting SBTs. So definitely, again, emissions data is always a very important first step.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Howard, for your insightful answers. So again, thank you, our speakers, so much for your insightful answers to the audience questions. And yeah, we look forward to receiving more inquiries from our audience via email after this webinar. And so we have covered all the topics that we have for our program today. Before closing the event, we would like to express our special thanks to all the speakers for your invaluable contribution and insights, which we believe will be of great help for other stakeholders on their green finance journey. And our sincere thanks to all the participants for joining our event today. So it's now time to say goodbye, and we hope to welcome you again soon in our upcoming events. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.